Okay, to be mindful of everyone's time, I think we can go ahead and get going. We'll have a few more people probably hop on, but just want to say hello and welcome. My name is Jasmine Howard. I'm the president of the Junior League of Boston. We are excited to welcome and host this joint event with the Junior League of Houston on such an impactful topic. We are excited to have Dr. Sharp here to present to us today. I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer Williams to present Dr. Sharp.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Williams. I'm the DEI director at the Junior League of Houston. We have Dr. Jessica Sharp, who is a Junior League leader and organizational psychologist who will discuss power and accountability. She's going to inspire you to interrogate power and provide a few practical tips to practice accountability. And now I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Hey, I'm really looking forward to being with y'all today. And I'm going to share my slides in just a second. But in the meantime, if you all want to go in the chat and let us know which league you're a member of, either Houston or Boston, and what your placement is, probably for next year, since we're sort of in this time frame where we're looking more towards next year. Selfishly, things like that are helpful for me to know as I'm sort of thinking about examples. But then I also think it's a helpful way to start to connect beyond just our individual leagues. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up the slides. And again, sort of in the meantime, you all can put that in the chat. And just so you know, I'll sort of go back and forth in between slides and not, because for reasons that really frustrate me, on a Mac, this is very sort of inside baseball, but on a Mac, I can't see my mouse when I'm presenting a slideshow. It's very frustrating, but whatever. So I'll be going back and forth. But again, let me know sort of in the chat which league you're a member of, and then what your placement is, either for this year or for next year. So a little bit sort of about, a little bit more about me in the context of the Junior League and sort of the league, and a little bit of how we got to this training. So I am a transfer member to the Junior League of Houston. Initially, I was a member of the Junior League of Greenville in South Carolina. So a larger league in terms of size, and obviously a Southern league, and did really a variety of placements within the Junior League of Greenville, including serving in a DE&I capacity, and pretty much every council, I think, except finance. But throughout sort of that time, I got to know and am friends sort of outside of the Junior League with Casey Minor, who is a transfer member to the Junior League of Boston. And so we are both transfers, and we started talking about what it, sort of doing a joint session like this. And selfishly, I am interested in doing something like this because my placement beginning on July 1st is I'll be an AJLI board member and the governance chair, the governance vice chair, and then chair for AJLI. So I'm interested in talking to as many league leaders as I can. And then just sort of a reminder of who we are. We might be in very different parts of the US, but at the end of the day, the thing that unites us is that we are all members of the Junior League. And our vision for the league is women around the world, because we are far beyond just the United States, as catalysts for lasting community change. I know that pretty much every Junior League member I've ever known is really interested in creating change for the long term in communities, so that we don't sort of need to continue to be helping in the way that we are, so that communities can everybody in communities can get what they need. We've had a recent mission change, AJLI, and so therefore all of the junior leagues. And I actually really love our mission change because I feel like it's more focused. But essentially, we are advancing women's leadership to impact community change, right, through volunteer action, collaboration, and training like this. So it's another reason why I'm really excited to be doing a training like this with two different leagues. The other thing that sort of, as I was planning this session, as Casey and I were thinking about what this session could be, a few other things that came to mind are some of the focus areas for AJLI, but a lot of individual leagues sort of have very similar sort of focus areas and priorities. And two of those are creating a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into everything we do. If you've ever heard me speak before or know anything about me, you know that belonging is my jam. My doctoral degree, my research is on the concept of belonging. So I can talk about that whenever you all want. But, we obviously know there are some leagues who are doing a really good job with this, but pretty much across the board, all of our leagues, we should be doing and need to be doing better holistically from a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging standpoint. And so I'll talk some about that. And then also connecting members across the junior league community. So beyond exclusively our individual member junior league. So I'm going to get out of my screen for just a second and sort of pause my sharing because I'm going to just hop in the chat to see again sort of who's with us. And I know that you all see the chat as we're going, but I always like to just sort of acknowledge what's in the chat. So obviously we've got folks from both leagues. We've got lots of different community chairs, grants, STEM committees, strategic planning, VP placements, overnight Children's Museum. I live very close to the Children's Museum here in Houston, so I'm sort of obsessed with it. So folks in lots of different areas in the league. And so I feel like you all will hopefully appreciate this training because I really was thinking about various different sort of placements in addition to ideally just leadership roles. So even though I'm going to talk a lot about power and accountability, the sort of at the root of this, when I was creating what this training could be, when I was like, what do I think league members need to know more about? I was thinking about it from a diversity and inclusion standpoint. And, you know, there's sort of no shame for me in that. And, you know, even though I know a lot of leagues, you know, as I've mentioned, there are leagues that are, you know, doing a really good job with DE&I, right? There are some organizations that are doing a great job with DE&I, but on the whole, almost all of us, leagues and otherwise, probably need to be doing a little bit better. The things that I have seen leagues focus on a good bit is around the big D, the diversity piece, right? We've, you know, tried to make sure that we are diversifying our membership pipeline. So whether that may be thinking about where you're holding recruitment efforts, how you're communicating to people, how accessible the league feels from a recruitment and membership perspective. But I also know that leagues have been thinking about how do we diversify leadership pipelines, right? How do we make sure that our committee chairs, our committee vice chairs, our board members represent both the league that we want to be, but also represent the community. And we're going to need to continue to think about diversity for some time, right? In my experience, and this is just Dr. Sharp's experience, other people may have a different one, but in my experience, when we are talking about diversity, particularly in the nonprofit sector, we're still talking about race. Right. In my experience, when sort of interrogating the corporate sector, we're still talking quite a bit about gender, but with nonprofits, we're thinking about race. And like, hear me clearly, race is important for a whole lot of reasons, particularly here in the South, right? But also there are a whole lot of other things beyond simply diversity. And so the other thing I want us to think about as much as diversity is equity and creating an organization where people who are different from what our norm currently is have access to opportunities. I had a job in Greenville once with a nonprofit, and Casey probably knows which one I'm talking about, but I worked at a nonprofit and I was hired on their leadership team because I was different, primarily by age, right? I was probably 20 years younger than everybody else on the leadership team. And my style was a little bit different in terms of how I led. And there was no secret that I was different and they sort of wanted me to be different. And that's why they hired me. Well, I think I lasted in that job like a year and a half because really quickly, I sort of figured out that even though what they desired was something different, the culture of the organization did not create space for a different type of communication style, a different type of leadership style, right? There wasn't actually space for that, right? And even down to things like policies and how power was handled. So as much as I want us to keep thinking about diversity, I also want us to make sure that we're spending time on equity too, which, if I'm being honest, is probably a little bit harder. So I share another story about the Junior League of Greenville, again, where Casey and I are, where we both joined the league. And I'm going to sort of share this story as an entryway into the conversation around power. So the Junior League of Greenville used to have, it was about 10 or 11 years old when they sort of sunset it, but they used to have a really large scale community event called Home Run for Healthy Kids. And every year, about 4,000 kids would come from school to the baseball stadium that's in Greenville and have sort of like a healthy kid experience. So it was always a fun thing. It required basically all of the Junior League provisionals and a bunch of other members to volunteer. And it was really one of our sort of favorite community events. And it was 2 days. And that 2 days, as you can imagine, had a lot of sort of logistics and things that needed to be coordinated. Well, the first time I was on the board of the Junior League of Greenville, the president at that time she loved Home Run for Healthy Kids. She really, really did. And so when she was transitioning to being president, from president-elect, she decided that she wanted Home Run for Healthy Kids to be 3 days. And so she made that decision. She did not have conversations with the chair of Home Run for Healthy Kids, because I remember the conversations I had with the chair of Home Run for Healthy Kids after she found out. And she didn't talk to the community VP. She sort of felt like that was what was best, and she had the power to make that decision. And so she did. And I won't go into all of the sort of gory details, but needless to say, by the second time I was on the board, which was only a few years later, we were sunsetting that event. Essentially, we were taking on too much, and there wasn't enough sort of diverse thought in sort of considering that. But those sort of decisions and the implications of those sort of decisions happen every day in junior leagues. And it's because, at least sort of one of my beliefs, is because of our relationship to power and to leadership. And one of my favorite books on belonging, it's called Community, The Structure of Belonging. Peter Block, he's an organizational psychologist and a researcher, and he talks about this concept that I'm sort of enamored with called romanticizing leadership. And if you sort of think about it, it's this idea of sort of putting leaders on pedestals, right? He says we are fascinated with our leaders, and we sort of allow our leaders to be sort of cause and effect, right? You know, they cause a lot of things to happen, right? And they sort of can control the effect. And if we think about our Home Run for Healthy Kids example, that sort of was, you know, she was cause of this thing happening, this sort of 3-day event, right? When we romanticize leaders, when we put them on pedestals, when we sort of allow them to both make decisions unchecked, right? Oftentimes, and I know they have a board, I've been on a junior league board before, but you know, if you've been on a board before, you probably know that sometimes presidents have a little bit of unchecked power, right? And when we sort of, and people aren't gonna like that I say this, but that's okay. When we put sort of a lot of like pomp and circumstance around being president of the junior league, right? And it's a big deal. But when we sort of make this like, this is the end all be all, there can be some consequences to that, right? We can get sort of unconsciously have this belief that the only thing that counts is what our leaders do, right? You know, that those of us who are committee members, right? Those of us who, even those of us who are taking leaves, right? Or who don't have what we would feel like is an impactful placement, that what we do doesn't really matter, right? And that it may or may not be seen. The other thing that happens almost sort of as a consequence of that, right, is that we sort of unknowingly let our members off the hook, right? If I was talking to an organization, I would probably say employees, right? But when we sort of say the only thing that matters is presidents, then it allows our members to be off the hook. I have a friend who's worked at AJLI for a long time, and she travels to different leagues a lot. And she says that, you know, she'll travel to leagues either to speak to, you know, at a general meeting or to do some sort of training. And she says she cannot like sort of count the number of times where the person who is coordinating both all of the logistics and picking her up and managing 25 other things is the president, right? And I think there's a lot of reasons that happens, but one of them may be that members, whether we do it on purpose, whether it is sort of in our control, we sort of are sometimes let off the hook, right? So I want to sort of use this as sort of a connection to talk about power. And I want to hear from you all, but I want to hear from you all using this function called Mentimeter, which most of you probably know what this is. But I'm going to first sort of go through process, and I'm going to ask you the question. So I want you, either you can take out your phone or tablet and, you know, just click on this QR code and it'll bring you up to a link, or you can copy and paste this link. I'm gonna put it in the chat in just a second. But I want to hear from you all. When you think of power, right? Organizational power, power attached to leadership, right? I want you to sort of think about what are 1 to 2 words that really describe your perception of power. Right? So what is your view of power? And again, you can either screenshot, you can just sort of click on your phone on this QR code, or I'm gonna put this in the chat. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen first so that we're not all sort of distracted. I'm gonna put in the chat the link to the Mentimeter. And again, all you have to do is either just go to this link or scan the QR code. And I just want to hear from you all. What is your perception of power? And I'm going to go to the Mentimeter just to sort of see what folks are saying, and then I'll share it in just a second. And if you have questions about the process of this, just take yourself off mute and ask me. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen again so that we can start to see the responses. And you all probably know how these word cloud Wordle things work. The larger the word is, the more often it is represented in responses. But if you're responding, you can keep responding. It just sort of changes as it goes. But our perception of power, hierarchy, decision maker, earned respect. Oh, I've never heard that response. I like that one. Leadership, influence, leader, control, responsibility. I like that answer a lot. Respect, strength, elite. Ooh, that is an interesting word because it can have positive or negative or neutral connotations. So again, decision maker, responsibility, control. If there's anybody who is comfortable taking themselves off mute and wants to sort of elaborate on the 1 to 2 words that they said, I'm going to create some space for that right now. So if you're like, I have more to say, just take yourself off mute and say those words. So what I think is interesting sort of about this list is that you all didn't, there's not necessarily an inherent positive or negative or neutral, right? There's sort of I feel like a lot of ways to describe what power is, and some things that are in sort of a definition of power, and some things that are not, right? But again, seeing things like decision maker, final decision maker, secret, that's really interesting. So some of those things may or may not be so good, and established. So I'm going to shift and we're going to talk a little bit more about power. But in my experience, the way in which you perceive power sometimes either can sort of get in the way of sort of generating power, or it can taint the way that we view people who are in power. So one of the best definitions of power that I've ever seen, and a definition that I've seen sort of similarly described in other places, is Martin Luther King Jr.'s definition of power as the ability to achieve purpose and affect change, which that aligns with much of what you all said, right? You said words like decision maker, right? Control, the ability to control and sort of dictate what happens, right? Leadership as ideally the ability to affect change. But what I think is important about that definition is that it isn't inherently good, bad, or neutral. It just sort of is, right? And the other thing that I think is important to say and to acknowledge is that power is essential to making things happen. Right. And if you want to change anything, right, if you want to change something for the positive, if you feel like, oh, something bad is happening and we need to make a change, you have to have some sort of power to make that happen. But the sort of balance that I feel like is important to achieve, which is why we're going to continue to talk, is how can we achieve power? How can we sort of achieve purpose and affect change through power without sort of getting us to a place where there's control that is sort of unchecked, right? Where one leader can make a decision that sort of unknowingly or knowingly is going to impact potentially the future of the organization, right? Because again, right, wrong, or indifferent, we allow our board members and presidents to make a lot of decisions in our organization. So what gives people power in organizations? Some of you all said, the thing that I felt like I saw a lot was decision maker, right? And a lot of times positional power comes with decision making, but I want to just sort of make sure that we all know that there are multiple ways of sort of attaining power. Because the other thing that I know is that everybody in this training right now is not what we would call a positional leader in the junior league. right? I'm a committee member in the Junior League of Houston. I don't have any sort of formal or positional power, right? But that doesn't mean that there's not some sort of other power that I have or somebody else has. So there's obviously, like I've mentioned, power of position, which is what sort of we've been talking about, and certainly what I think a lot of people think about. But you have the formal authority to make a decision, right? To do something with the organization. These leaders tend to also have control and access to resources, whether that's sort of financial resources, sort of flow of information, right? They sort of can control things. They often also have the ability to either sort of, in traditional words, reward or punish, right? Sometimes power position, you have the authority to appoint or slate someone, right? I think about this as I'm going into the governance role for AJLI, right? There's these positions, we have the power to appoint or slate, right? So I think about that a lot, but I also think about the fact that there's other ways that we achieve power. Certainly there's power of charisma or personality, right? We can all think of a leader that like we just would sort of follow them off the ends of the earth because they inspire trust, right? They inspire enthusiasm. You're like, whatever they're selling, I'm here for it. Sometimes, right, leaders have both. They have the positional power and sort of charismatic or personality power. The power of networks or relationships is the influence a leader gains through informal or formal networks, both inside and outside of the organization, right? So this is sort of who do we know and what are those relationships like? I think about like a community vice president as an example, right? A lot of times that community VP has some really strong relationships with community organizations, and that's part of how they are successful in their role as a community VP. And then last, the power of knowledge is the influence that we get from having knowledge or expertise. So it may be sort of a certain area, right? Like, Casey is an accountant. There's just some stuff that she knows that I don't know, right? Sometimes in the league, I feel like this can look like, we may have members who have a lot of institutional knowledge, right? About the league, about things that we've done. And so they have sort of a level of power, right, because of their knowledge and because of how long they've been in the league. And so I sort of wanted to talk about power sort of for two reasons. One, because I think if we don't effectively understand power and what it means, I'm not sure that we can effectively understand leadership, right? Because if a leader has like no power at all, not even power of position, right? Then, I think what the joke is like, they're just sort of wandering in the forest and there's nobody actually following them, right? But if we want to understand leadership, and we're a women's leadership organization, we need to understand power. The other thing is, if we want to create equity, right, where all of our members have, equal access to opportunities within the league, right, that members can join and say, I want to learn how to be better at this, or I want to be a better leader, and then I want to serve the junior league in this capacity, right, that there are pathways for them to do that. We have to examine and interrogate power because the reality is, and again, people probably won't love that I say this, but that's okay. The reality is we have some situations in some leagues across the country where power is sort of, it sits in sort of a very small space, and we need to find ways to sort of distribute that power. And one of the ways to do that is to understand accountability, because again, they have a relationship. And the more research that I have done on power, the more that accountability has shown up. So I'm going to share a little bit with you about accountability and then ask you to share something in the chat. And then we're leading up to a small group discussion where you're in breakout rooms. So when accountability is MIA, right, when we feel like, across members, across sort of with our leaders within the league, just sort of the larger culture of the league, we don't really have accountability. So I'll sort of define what accountability is, but for now, I want to talk about what it isn't. So the opposite of accountability, right, is not taking responsibility, right? If I'm not accountable to someone or something, I am not taking any responsibility for it, right? And if something happens that is not great, right, or that is not what we wanted to happen, that's not my fault. That's not my responsibility, right? If I'm just sort of like making this up, but if I go to a general membership meeting and, I feel like the care of the space is not my responsibility, right? If there's trash on the floor, if there's, sort of trash on the tables, you've been at GMMs at the end, right, where everybody is helping clean up. But if we all just say, nope, that's not my responsibility and we leave, right? That's not us taking accountability for what is best for our league and for our organization. In organizations, when we have a consistent lack of accountability, it can create a sense of disappointment, right? And I've seen this sort of individually in members. It can absolutely create a sense of inequity, and it can create a sense of insecurity, right? So this idea of inequity, like some things are okay for some people, but not others, right? And then it can create an internal sense of insecurity, sort of like, I'm not sure if I'm on stable footing here, if I'm on safe ground here. And that is important because for so many of us, the league is our place, right? Like the league is very likely sort of some way, shape, or form attached to our identity, right? Like it certainly is for me. It has been for me for a very long time, right? The league is oftentimes like the place where we feel like our strongest connections are, right? For some of us, it's like the place where we feel like this is where I'm supposed to be. And so to feel insecure or like, I'm not really sure if things are fair here can feel really unsafe. So I'm going to ask a question in the chat again. So on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being, I agree completely, to 1 being, I don't agree at all, that is not my experience, I don't agree with this statement. Thinking about these 2 statements, you can sort of give 2 individual answers or just 1 in the chat, but how much do you agree with these statements, right? That, the opposite of accountability is not taking responsibility and saying that's not my responsibility, that's not my fault. And that the consequences of a lack of accountability, right, across an organization, is a sense of disappointment, insecurity, inequity, right? So just pop it in the chat. You can just share a number, but how much do you feel like these statements are true or untrue? And I'm going to keep this in the background for just another second so that you all can see the questions, and then I'll probably stop sharing. But for now, I'll pull up the chat. And no, I might ask y'all a follow-up question. So 4s and 5s. 4 for the first, 5 for the second. So I want you all, as folks are still sort of sharing their numbers, I want you to think about, and I'm gonna sort of ask somebody to put themselves on the spot here, but can you all individually think of a time in the junior league, outside the junior league, in an organization, traditional or otherwise, that you noticed that there was a lack of accountability, right? And sort of what the consequences of that were. So I'm gonna give y'all a second to think. And I'm gonna ask somebody to share. So think about a time, junior league or otherwise, that you felt like no one is accountable to anything here. And then what did that practically look like? And like, what were the consequences? So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And then I'm gonna put myself on mute so that whoever is like really interested in sharing about accountability is gonna be able to do that.
I can share. My name is Emily. So I've had instances in the workplace where there was no accountability. And what that looked like was just not really correcting bad behavior and kind of lack of like getting things done to the commitments that had been promised and like deadlines and stuff. And the consequences of that, I think, as someone who was doing those things, it made me think like, why am I working so hard? If nothing happens when you don't do what you say you're going to do, why, it just kind of, everything fell apart a little bit in terms of like the team norms and, feeling accountable both to what people on the team said they were going to do, but also to each other. If you have, everyone's been on those teams where people aren't pulling their weight. And I think there's always a point at which you're like, well, why am I working so hard if there are no consequences?
Yeah. So, when you're not correcting poor behavior or behavior that is inconsistent from what you want, right? There's this like, and I've had this happen in a workplace too, where it's like, well, why am I doing this? And even people who are, the best, members, leaders, employees, et cetera, like we are still humans. And so even if, we want to, we're the type of people who are like, give 110%, it's really difficult to do that when other people aren't held to that same standard. Also in the chat from Casey, I also think the opposite of accountability is apathy, which can be even more pervasive than actively choosing not to take accountability, right? Because when you're sort of like, I'm actively not caring, right? Everything, even about your energy, begins to shift, and that can sort of be infectious to the people around you. So Lucy said, I agree with Emily, and further delegated accountability to those that are productive, still with no repercussions for those who aren't delivering, right? So we're just going to keep having these same committee members do stuff, or we're going to keep asking these same members to take these placements because we know they're going to do it, even though these 25 members over here are going to continue to, if I remember from past board meetings, we're going to sort of wave the membership wand and say, it's okay that you haven't done anything we've asked you to do and you've ignored us all year. That's okay. No big deal. We want you to stay because, we want you to. And then we're going to just ask, Jasmine and Jennifer over here to just keep doing all these things, right? It creates sort of an infectious energy. And it's no secret, I don't think, right, that AJLI and individual leagues across the country are, depending on the league, depending on the size, depending on the location, are dealing with various issues related to membership recruitment, membership retention, membership engagement, right? If I have heard one league leader, I have heard 25 of them say, we can't get anybody to do anything, right? We don't get people to sign up for things. People don't show up for things. There are a lot of reasons why that happens, right? And I'm certainly not about to tell you that power and accountability is the end all be all answer, but I bet it's one of them, right? So I want to real quick sort of talk about what accountability is and what it looks like, right? And these are things that we probably know, but sort of the former educator in me feels compelled to just make sure we're on the same page because words are important. So what accountability is, in that same Peter Block book that I mentioned earlier, he talks about accountability as a willingness to care for the whole, right? So a willingness to say, I am going to commit to what is best for this whole group, right? I've heard members, even one on this call right now, say like, oh, I didn't necessarily want to take that placement, but I knew that it was what was best, right? Like there wasn't anybody else to fill it. I can do a good job in that placement. This is probably what's best, right? We've all done things, whether in individual relationships, at work, within the league, that we're like, oh, I don't really feel like it, but it's okay, right? Because we're accountable to what is best for this whole group, right? Accountability and engaging in actions where we are accountable, it creates interdependency and trust. And interdependency, right, is this idea that we can rely on each other, right? Even for this training, right? The idea of like, we're getting these two leagues, all the individual sort of people that, we all were accountable to each other, right? Which created a level of interdependency of like, I need you to do this thing over here, right? And I will tell you, most of the belonging definitions that I've seen talk about the importance of interdependency. And trust, you can do almost nothing without some sort of trust, right? Accountability allows us to create something transformative, right? Something that is better than what we would have been able to do otherwise. Because in theory, if we have really strong cultures and everybody feels like I am accountable to this group, we're all probably going to try like a little bit harder, right? Than if we feel like there's a sort of a culture of complacency, right? And a culture of not being held accountable. Accountability is a choice, right? I can, every day that I walk into, a junior league meeting, let's say, I can choose to say, that's not my problem. I don't care, right? Or I can choose to say, I'm going to care about this. This is something that I'm going to work towards, or I'm going to, sort of take responsibility for. And the thing that I kept reading about accountability, I was reading a book about trust by Stephen Covey, and he talks about accountability as a way to build trust. And he kept talking about the importance of holding ourselves accountable first, right? If I have a junior league deadline for my committee, and I say to myself, and we're all different, right? We're all, all of us procrastinate in such different ways. But if I say to myself, I know I have to send those emails for the league, but I don't really feel like it, and I'm just not going to do it. how can I sort of expect to, sort of be accountable to everybody else if I'm not even accountable to myself to say, now, girl, you said you're going to send those emails today, and today is the deadline. So let me send these emails, right? So it all sort of, a lot of the things that I read about accountability started with being accountable to ourselves first, right? When we, in this hypothetical where we're about to leave a GMM and we see all these tables that clearly need to sort of be put up, are we going to say, okay, what choice am I going to make now? Am I going to be accountable to myself in this group, or am I going to say, I'm just not going to do it? Now, if accountability was this thing that was easy for everyone to do, if it was easy for all leaders everywhere to hold everybody accountable, we wouldn't have had almost everybody on this call say, yes, I agree with all of these statements, and I've had experiences where somebody isn't held accountable. So I want you to think about first, and then I'm gonna, in just a second, put you in some small groups and sort of talk. But the thing I want us to think about first is, why do we struggle to hold people accountable? What is the reason why we consistently sort of do not hold people to standards that we set, or do we not hold people to behavior that we all know is best for a group, right? Like if we all know that when we when we volunteer together as, a Junior League Impact Committee, right? When we're all going together, we all know that we're not going to be on our phones because we're volunteering and it's only 2 hours, right? We want to set a good example, right? If we all know that we do that, but we all know that there's one member who always just blatantly says, I'm going to be on Instagram because I feel like it. When we don't hold that person accountable, why is that so hard for us? So I'm going to sort of stop sharing my screen, and I want to either hear from you all, or you can put something in the chat, and sort of in the meantime, I'm going to be getting these breakout rooms ready. But why is it hard for us to hold people accountable? And again, you can put something in the chat or take yourself off mute.
I think there's always a fear of being perceived as being mean or sort of chastising someone.
Mm-hmm. So being mean or chastising, lack of feeling empowered to do so. And I think this can be especially true if I'm a committee member and my other committee member is doing something that we all know is not what we expect. I may not feel like I can't or I'm supposed to say anything because I am a committee member. I don't have any positional power, right? Avoiding confrontation. We are a volunteer organization. We're not paid to be here. So people think that they really can't get in trouble if they do something wrong or incorrect. And I would also argue the opposite, that because we're volunteers, we may feel like, because I have heard people say this, particularly about boards outside the Junior League, well, they're volunteers, so we can't expect them to do fill in the blank, even though they actually said that they were going to do those things. Not wanting to be perceived as controlling or demanding, less of that reporting hierarchy makes it hard to hold your peers accountable, right? It's just easier not to deal with it. Easier to do it myself and make my expectations clear. So let me just make sure that my behavior is what it's supposed to be because it's easier, right? It's a difficult discussion to have, to essentially, quote, call somebody out and to deem their behavior inappropriate or acceptable. And Lord knows it's true, you never know what response you're going to get, right? So even if it's things that we all know, right, that is a behavior that's inappropriate, you can call somebody out and you have no idea what response they're going to get. And how do we do this now back and forth, right? So it can feel really sort of scary. Fear of some sort of retaliation. I think that is especially true when we are trying to hold someone accountable who is in a position, has some sort of positional power, right? Because what are the consequences to me when I don't have that positional power? Yep, avoiding conflict. So if you've got more things to put in the chat, I do so want you to sort of put things in the chat. I think that what you all have to say is really important. This is another good one I'm going to read out. You could call them out and then you might not perform to the same standard, right? So you may feel like, you may call somebody out and then the next day you have a really bad meeting and you're like, oops, I just called them out for the same thing. So certainly I have thoughts about how to handle this, but in my experience, the best sort of conversations and solutions come from people who are actually doing the work. And yes, I'm a junior league member, but still. So I'm going to put us into small groups in just a second. And I want us to talk for just about 7 minutes. So it's not going to be a long time. It's probably not going to be nearly as much time as we actually want. We might be able to do a little bit longer. But I'm going to put the question in the chat in just a second. But I want us to sort of talk about how can we, knowing all of these barriers, knowing all of these things that get in the way of holding individuals accountable, holding our organization accountable, right? All of these things that we share that I agree with, right? Not being seen as a micromanager, right? Knowing that volunteers have a lot going on and that we don't want to put any extra sort of burden on them. How can we be a league that more consistently holds people accountable? Now, this is sort of a little bit, I think, later on a slide, but I'm going to give you almost like a, like the teacher in me is like, I'm going to give you like a little teaser for one of the things I think is important. Another thing that I kept reading about in accountability was the importance of expectations. And you all have sort of talked a little bit about this, but it is awfully hard to hold someone accountable for something when we haven't been clear. So I'm going to give you a concrete example of when we have been clear, but then sort of bridge that example a little bit further. So I moved to Houston about 1.5 years ago. I graduated college like 1 year ago. And I don't know, I felt like I didn't have enough to do. So I got a part-time job here in Houston at the Container Store. It's great. I'm sort of obsessed with it. But we have a dress code. It's very clear. It's a retail place. Here's what you're supposed to wear. Here's what you're not supposed to wear, right? One of my colleagues, my coworkers, she's out dress code every day. She doesn't care. She sort of has blatantly said she is going to do what she wants to do. She's told me and anybody who listen that she is going to consistently be out of dress code, and it does not matter. In this situation, the expectations were very, very, very clear, right? And this employee has chosen, continues to choose, to not do that, right? But there may be times where we have not been clear about expectations, right? If we haven't been clear with volunteers that we don't want them to be on their phone when they're volunteering in the community, it is very difficult to hold someone accountable to that if they weren't ever told that this is the expectation. Even if you feel like, well, they should know better. Why? How? Right? So that's sort of just like one other thought that I want you to have in your brain as you think about things. But I'm going to put you all in 5 breakout rooms. And if you'll notice, there's no like leader for the breakout rooms. I don't think that we need this for this. The way that I envision these breakout rooms happening is that I will put you all in the breakout rooms. I'll make sure that you have the question again. And then I'll give you a time, and I just sort of expect that one of you all will start talking. And then afterwards, everybody will sort of be able to engage in a debrief. But the question, and I'm going to put this again in the chat in just a second, but how can league members, right? We are all members, whether you have a formal position in leadership or not. At the end of the day, you're still a junior league member. How can we sort of more consistently hold people accountable? How can we increase our culture of accountability? Again, knowing all of the things that I said about, and that you all said about how difficult it can be. So I'm going to break you up I'm going to put you in the breakout room and then give you about 7 minutes. But then if you feel like we're already done, just let me know in the chat, because you can let me know either way. And then if you have questions, you can obviously let me know as well. And for now, I'm going to include all the co-hosts in a breakout room, but if one of you all needs to come out, that's fine too. Okay, so now you should sort of be seeing the breakout rooms. You should be able to start joining them. Welcome back. Everybody should be rejoining within the next, let's say, I think 30 or 45 seconds. And for those of you who are joining, feel free to open, I just put a link in the chat. I'll put it in again in just a second, because I don't know that everybody can see it right now, for a Jamboard. We're going to utilize that as a means to debrief. So you can go ahead and pull that up and get it ready. You're like me, I'm like to have things prepped. And I hope everybody enjoyed their breakout room. I know that it's never enough time. I think we have maybe all but maybe one breakout room back in. I've put a link in the chat to a Jamboard, and I'm going to share my screen now as folks, I think, continue to come back. With a group this large, as much as I would like desperately want to hear from all of you and or every single group about how your breakout session went, that would require that we have more than an hour of your time. So I'm trying something new. If y'all hate it, you can tell me. But as a means for you all to sort of just share any takeaways from your breakout session, we're going to utilize a Jamboard. If you know how to use it, you can start using it now. But if not, I've shared my screen so you can sort of see it. But on this side, you can use a sticky note function and you can just type in, or you can use a text box function and it'll just let you type. But I would love to just hear any sort of ahas or really big takeaways from your breakout rooms. And you can obviously just take yourself off mute and share that way. But if you've, heard something really great in your breakout room, or if you shared something great in your breakout room, utilize the Jamboard to share that with us. Again, you can do it as a sticky note or just a text. Or you may say, I still have questions, and put that on that Jamboard too. But so not assuming knowledge, teaching and training early and often around expectations. And as other folks are sharing, the other thing that I love about, early and often around expectations is, even if you are not in sort of a positional power, let's say you're a committee member, you can ask your committee chair. You can say, hey, I'd love for us to touch base about expectations. I want to make sure that I'm clear on what is expected of me, right? And then you can have a larger conversation about expectations. Make it known upfront when you are, I'm going to move this one over. I love that we can all move this at the same time. So make it known upfront when you are a leader in the setting or having experience with this particular activity. So setting expectations are sort of just sharing like, hey, I have some information here to share. I like this. Employing a charter style document that defines expectations so that there's always a source of accountability. In my doctoral program, we did that. We were sort of told to do that all the time, to have sort of a document where we went through expectations and we talked about things like group norms, how we were going to talk, how we were going to hold each other accountable, all of that. And I will tell you, the groups who didn't do that, and there was really sort of one time this happened, but the groups that didn't do that, there ended up just being consequences in terms of how their group operated. And I'm gonna leave this up for another minute or two so we can wrap up. Set out tasks to specific people. Making sure that those people know what they have, what their task is, right? So my committee chair this year for the Junior League of Houston, she was always really good about that. Before we got off a call, she would say, okay, who is doing what specific task, right? And making sure that we either had what we needed or that she knew what we needed, right? So that then it was really clear for me to say, I know what my task is, I know when it is due, right? And I know I have the tools that I need, right? That's another thing that I think could be important to think about in the context of the league is making sure that everybody has the tools that they need. Because I certainly don't know how the Junior League of Boston is, but both with Houston and in Greenville, like the website, it has stuff in all sorts of places, right? And if you are intuitive with it, you're like, oh, this is here and this is here. But if you're not, you may sort of be like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. So feel free to put other ideas in here. Because I'm sort of planning on sending this out in addition to the Mentimeter, but I'm going to share my slides one last time. Those aren't my slides. These are my slides for the next 2 minutes. So just some real specific things around actions for accountability beyond really what you all said. And I sort of pulled this from a few different resources, but as we said, consistently clarify expectations. And that is both expectations in terms of tasks, but even more important, expectations around how we will interact with each other, right? When are our committee meetings going to be, right? And those things are sort of generally standard, but, if I can't be at a meeting, when am I supposed to tell you? How am I supposed to tell you as a committee chair, right? Those sort of, if somebody does something that is inconsistent with our expectations, right? How are we going to manage? So just being very clear around expectations. And again, even as a committee member, you can say, hey, can we just make sure we're all clear on what's expected of us? Be clear on how you will communicate how you're doing, right? So if I'm on a committee and I have tasks in between committee meetings, which most of us do, how am I supposed to tell my committee chair if I'm done, or if there's something I need in between? Am I supposed to wait, right? Asking those questions before we leave each other. The other thing that I would add to this from experience more than anything is being clear on how you will communicate when expectations are not met, or when the norms that we as a board, as a committee have decided, right? We've decided this is how we will interact, how we will work together. If you're a group of people, you probably need committee norms or group norms. What happens when somebody goes outside of those norms, right? Because if we can decide that up front, all of the sort of messiness that we talked about, right? Not knowing what's going to happen, somebody may be calling you out, not knowing how they're going to respond. We've addressed that up front, right? Doesn't mean people are perfect. You might catch somebody on a bad day, right? But if we can be clear up front, it's going to make things easier moving forward. The last thing sort of is don't avoid responsibility. It feels really easy and clear, but it's not, right? If we all say, these are the expectations, this is how we're going to hold somebody accountable, and I act outside of those expectations, or if I do something that's just like, that's opposite of what we all said we were going to do, I can't sort of get defensive and say, well, I was having a bad day, right? We're all humans. We all have bad days, right? I need to say, I effed up and that's on me. I had a bad day, but that's still on me, right? So starting with us and then sort of communicating that across, but I almost can't overstate the importance of being clear. And before you stop that process, saying, how are we going to hold each other accountable to the things that we said we were going to do, right? So sort of in summary and closing, because I know that it is 12:29 my time. Sometimes we are great leaders, but sometimes we miss the mark here and we put our leaders, in my experience, and we presidents, when we put our leaders on pedestals, sometimes power can go completely unchecked, which absolutely gets in the way of equity, gets in the way of diversity, gets in the way of member satisfaction, and accountability can be missing in action. And we all know what it feels like to be a part of an organization where there's no accountability. To sort of consistently work on this. We're not always going to get this right, but to work on it more consistently, we need to be finding ways to expand and share power. This certainly includes leaders of the league, but also, if I have a lot of personality power, right? Or if I know a bunch of people in the league and I have a friend who's new in the league, I can expand her power by introducing her to the people I know. So finding ways to expand and share power, and then embracing accountability, certainly for yourself, but also for other committee members. We are about to start a new league year. So this feels like a perfect time when your committee member meetings are starting to say, hey, how are we going to hold each other accountable? So it's 12:30. So my homework for you to just ruminate on in your free time is, what is something that you'll do differently as a result of this discussion? And I'm pretty sure I'll send out some things via the two separate leagues. But for the people who care, here are all the sources I use. If you have follow-up questions, you can feel free to email me. I know I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes, but thank you all for your time. I know I really appreciate being able to talk to league leaders and members across the country. And so I appreciate you. And again, I'll stay on for another minute or two in case folks have questions.